Thank you so much to everybody that's joining us this evening. Welcome to our webinar. I want to turn things over to Penny.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us. My name is Penny Wright, and I work for the Rogers Memorial Library in Southampton, and we are very pleased to be having this event this evening. Our sincere thanks to the Cornell University Institute of Policy, Politics, and Global Affairs, of which Steve Israel is the director, and to Natalie Ryan, its senior associate, who has served as liaison for this event and who will be overseeing a Q&A period at the end. In addition, we thank the 14 East End libraries who have partnered with us and the Institute to present tonight's discussion to their audiences across the North and South Forks and Points West. And they are the Amagansett Library, Cutchogue New Suffolk Free Library, the Floyd Memorial Library, the Hampton Library in Bridgehampton, the John Germain Library in Sag Harbor, Mattituck Laurel Library, the Montauk Library, the Port Jefferson Free Library, the Quogue Library, Sachem Public Library, Southold Free Library, the Hampton Bays Public Library, the Riverhead Free Library, and the West Hampton Free Library. Congressman Steve Israel served in Congress for 16 years. He left in 2017, having served as House Democrats' chief political strategist between 2011 and 2015 as chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He is now the director of the nonpartisan Cornell University Institute of Politics and Global Affairs in New York City. While in Congress, he served on the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies, where he took a leading role in supporting historic preservation, land conservation, and cultural arts institutions. He is also currently a political commentator, a columnist, and a novelist, having written 2 critically acclaimed satires of Washington. And he's currently at work on another book. Congressman Israel, it is such an honor to have you here with us. Thank you from all of us.
Penny, thank you so much. So just delighted to be with you.
Thank you. Richard Salomon, the brainchild of tonight's event, is the founder and CEO of Vantage Point Consultants and the co-founder and vice president of the board of directors of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. He is involved in numerous philanthropic and social service-related activities and has served on a wide range of boards, including the advisory boards of Together We Remember and the Of Many Institute of NYU. He has organized, introduced, and moderated programs on a diverse set of topics with guests such as Nicholas Kristof, Adam Schiff, Preet Bharara, Lawrence Tribe, and many others, for such prestigious institutions as the 92nd Street Y, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and many more. Thank you so much, Mr. Salomon, for making this evening possible. And now I'm very happy to turn this program over to you, Mr. Salomon.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Natalie and Emily. Steve, I really appreciate you doing this. It is a wonderful event and looking forward to it. Steve is so knowledgeable and witty. I am reminded of a program I did with him last year at the Illinois Holocaust Museum on immigration reform, what has changed. And Steve interrupted me when I said he was an 8-term congressman to say, I just want to point out I'm undefeated and unindicted. And
it's a triumph these days.
Indeed, indeed. So you pick a zip code and Steve can tell you who's in, who's out, who is a winner and who's not contending. So as I go through my questions, you should think about how to stump Steve on a zip code. Steve and I spoke earlier this week on 3 overarching themes, which I'll touch on in the short time we have. 1, on the morass we find ourselves in this country. Number 2, all things presidential. And 3, the dysfunction of Congress. And whether, pray tell, I hope not, we're seeing the end of bipartisanship. So let me start with the morass and its different permutations. Whether it's Charlottesville, hate crimes, Steve, the issue of the pandemic, COVID-19, the pandemic that you could also argue with racial injustice that's beset our country for 400 years, lack of relations with allies, the turning back of environmental laws and policies, sadly at times where truth goes to die. You have a situation today, where Moynihan's comment, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own set of facts. It's a problem when you have the President of the United States saying that if we did no more testing of COVID, there'd be no more cases, and the Vice President writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that we're not going to have a second wave when we're still in the first. I don't know where you want to begin. How do we extricate ourselves from these different issues, if I may ask so?
Well, thank you so much, Rick, for the question. Let me just take a minute to thank Penny and the Rogers Memorial Library in Southampton and all of its partners for doing this. I will tell you, separate and apart from your question, one of the long-term concerns I've had has actually been the sustainability of libraries in America. One of the amazing privileges that I had in 16 years in Congress, among many, was actually working with Ray Bradbury, who was devoting himself to supporting libraries. I contributed to that cause as a member of the Appropriations Committee. I worry about the deterioration of civic engagement, civic discourse, and civic literacy in America. I think those three things are driving us to the morass that we're in right now. And libraries have always been at the very front of the effort to promote those civic virtues. And so this conversation, I think, is part and parcel of that. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions and also to taking questions from the folks who are participating today. Rick, that was a lot to unpack in your question. And so let me just give you a brief top line answer, and then we can delve into it and perhaps reflect as we take additional questions from the participants. One of the lessons that I learned in Congress was that nothing matters to many members of Congress until the military gives it an acronym. When the military gives something an acronym, many members of Congress suddenly, they kind of perk up and say, well, now that the military's given this an acronym, this really must be important. And several years ago, the U.S. Army War College, located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was projecting the state of the world, the state of the union, the state of our communities, the state of our politics over the next several years. And they came up with a wonderful acronym that defines exactly where we are. It's called VUCA. Some of you may have heard about it before. VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And if that does not define everything that we're going through, whether it's the East End of Long Island, or the state of New York, or the United States of America, or what we're seeing on television, this administration, the campaign to unseat this administration, the state of the world, I don't know what would define it other than VUCA. Second point I would make is that we are, I never pretended to be the smartest member of the House of Representatives, although the competition wasn't always that stiff, but I was just a very serious student of history. I love the history of the place. I still am a voracious reader of history. And when you look at American politics, it's always been cyclical. And so we've always been in moments, high and low. I mean, American politics and the American polity function based on cycles. What we're seeing now is the compression of decades of different cycles, all in one rather abbreviated period of time. And so this election in 2020, this election is like 1918, right, when we had a pandemic, and 1968, when we had riots in the street and upheaval, all in the same media cycle, all in the same compression of months. Indeed. We've never gone through anything like this, where you have this intense convergence of crises. And when that happens, and this is my final point on this question, and then we can delve into it if you'd like. When you have this, this convergence of crises, one of two things happen. Either the country through its leaders rise to the crises, and we get better for it, or sometimes you have leaders who exploit the crisis and demagogue the crisis, and we are worse off for it. And I think, and I know that this is a nonpartisan event, but we're all entitled to our own opinions. The thing I worry most about in our present leadership is that rather than rising to these crises, this 1918, 1968 moment, I believe that they are driven by exploiting it and demagoguing it, making us more fearful than we need to be, making us look with suspicion at one another, creating an us versus them atmosphere. And if you read all of world history and human history, you know that never works out for people. Those tools never work out for people. And so I'm hopeful that the American people, whether you're Republican, Democrat, far left, far right, at some point, we come back to civil debate engagement where facts do matter.
Well said. And I will unpack some elements as we go along, but let's stay for a minute on the racial injustice thing. Do you view what's happened with George Floyd and the other cases as a tipping point in some ways? And how do you see that as affecting the 2020 November election?
I do. And Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs just had a video seminar like this one featuring 4 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And I made this point. I think this is a tipping point because what I'm seeing, I have a beach house in Mattituck. So thanks to the Mattituck Library, Mattituck Laura Library for participating. And I have a home in Oyster Bay, right next to Theodore Roosevelt's grave and down the block from where he lived and died. In Oyster Bay, New York, when I drive through the streets, I see signs in front of mailboxes that say Black Lives Matter. I couldn't get those people to put up a lawn sign that said vote for Steve Israel, even though they were my friends. And they're putting up signs that say Black Lives Matter. I was driving from my place in Oyster Bay through Syosset on Jericho Turnpike to get to the Long Island Expressway to drive to the North Fork last weekend. And there was a lot of traffic at this intersection, and I heard horns blaring and honking, and I assumed that, this is New York and somebody was driving a little too slow. Rick, you know what the horns were blaring and honking at? A group of high school students protesting Black Lives Matter, but not honking against them, honking for them, and people waving. When issues when they creep into our kitchens and living rooms, when our children bring them home from school, when our children go to protests, that is the telltale sign of a tipping point. It's not that change is going to occur on Capitol Hill and then filter down. In this case, people want change in Syosset and Oyster Bay and Mattituck, and I think that's when you see the change begin to press up.
Well said. Let's turn a little to all things presidential. In 142 days, no one's counting, is Election Day. It actually happens, I don't know if you know this, Steve, but it actually is my birthday. I don't need anything, and I've only 2
What day is your birthday?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. November 3rd, my birthday.
Wow, happy birthday.
So, thank you. I have 2 wishes for the presidency and the Senate. We can leave that for some other day. So let's delve into a little of this. One key issue is the whole issue of absentee ballots. I think critical during an ongoing pandemic.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that, and whether, as we expect, there are going to be legal challenges to it that I have to believe as a lawyer aren't going to succeed? But
yeah. Well, look, this puzzles me, this issue of absentee ballots, and particularly the resistance to making it easier for people to vote during a pandemic. It puzzles me because, to your point about facts, being twisted and turned, the fact is that there is no evidence at all that even suggests that more absentee ballots help one party over the other. That is a myth, and it has been well documented. It also troubles me because it seems to me that the one thing that Democrats and Republicans should agree to immediately is making it easy for people to participate in democracy in any way they can. It troubles me, thirdly, because there is no evidence whatsoever that this massive voter fraud that some people talk about is taking place. It's a good soundbite, but I've yet to see any evidence by any credible analyst, either on the left or the right, that documents that there's massive voter fraud. Is there voter fraud? Yes. Does it rise to the level of massive? No. Is it usually the result of an honest mistake that somebody may have made? Yes. Does the President of the United States vote by absentee ballot? Yes, he does. Do the top members of his administration vote by absentee ballot? Yes, they do. And so if it's clean enough for them, then it ought to be clean enough for all of us. Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota has legislation that would fund state and local governments to create suitable absentee ballot programs to ensure that there is maximum participation. Final thought on this. You've seen, Rick, you've seen the news, you've seen voters lining up in Wisconsin, right? Just lining up. When Wisconsin was hitting peak COVID levels, lined up in Wisconsin, lining up in Georgia. What could be a worse message to send to those voters who are, it's not fraud. If you're willing to go out, risk getting sick, to stand in line to vote, you're not going to commit fraud. What could be worse than to tell those voters that their votes don't matter, that their ability to vote in democracy doesn't count? Worst possible message, especially at a time like this.
Totally agree. You obviously have the ear of Joe Biden, and we're in a new world, new normal, running a virtual campaign. What advice would you give him beyond obviously doing what he's doing with his town halls and interviews from his basement in Delaware? And speak a little to what you and I have talked about before about the 7 key battleground states that obviously is the point of focus.
Sure. Look, I think that this election is misread by both sides of the aisle and by a good number of pundits. And so let me give you 3 numbers, the 3 numbers that everybody needs to know to truly analyze the state of this election and where it is going. And those numbers are 20, 20, and 7. Okay, so 20, actually, let me just give it in a different order. 20, 7, and 20, okay? 20, the number 7, and the number 20. And here's how we break it down. 20% of the electorate is still undecided. This election is done with 80% of the electorate. This is a love or loathe electorate. 80% of the electorate either loves Donald Trump or loathes Donald Trump. There is nothing that is going to dissuade them from their positions. That leaves 20% who are still up in the air. So for people like, obviously, I have a picture of hanging out with Joe Biden behind me. My mind's made up. I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump. And I'm sure that there are people listening to this who think I'm out of my mind, who think I'm nuts and can't understand why my mind isn't made up for President Trump. That's 20%. The 7 is this. There are only 7 states that matter in this election. New York is voting for Joe Biden. Alabama is voting for Donald Trump. There are no elections in approximately 43 states. Done deal, decided. 7 battleground states: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona. Now, some pundits will say, well, you should include Colorado, maybe Ohio. Fair enough. I'm settled at 7. And the third number is 20. We go back to 20. And that's the approximately 20 battleground counties. You talked about zip codes before. 20 battleground counties in those 7 states that count. So I'll give you a very quick example. Wisconsin. When I'm trying to figure out whether President Trump will be reelected or not, I'm looking at Kenosha County, Wisconsin. It's an excerpt of Milwaukee. Obama and Biden carried Kenosha County in 2008 and 2012. Donald Trump won Kenosha County in 2016. He won it by less than 1% of the vote. That fragment enabled him to win Wisconsin. And by winning Wisconsin, he won the Electoral College. So this election is going to be decided by people of Kenosha in Wisconsin who are still undecided. My advice as a political clinician, I guess, diagnostician, the advice I give Joe Biden would be the same advice I would give Donald Trump. Just worry about those voters in Kenosha, in Erie, Pennsylvania, in Luzerne and Lackawanna, Pennsylvania, in Maricopa County, Arizona. That's where you really got to focus your efforts. Right now, President Trump is underwater in those areas. That's right now. We don't know what's going to happen in September or as we get closer. But right now, Biden is doing well in those areas. Why? Because those 20%, final point on this, that 20%, they tend to be very moderate. They'll swing back and forth. They tend to reward moderate left of center, right of center candidates and reject people who they believe are at the far extreme.
Well, that's why your advice is worth its weight in gold. You know, two questions flowing from that. One is on vice president. What's your, you know, if you were advising Biden on that, given what's gone on in this country of late,
yeah.
How do you have, if you're willing to disclose, you know, who are your top picks?
Jay Schneiderman, the supervisor. No, I'm kidding. You know, I'm not advising them on that. And I think one good way to become discredited with any campaign is to tell them that you know better than they do who the vice president should be. So I've not provided any advice in my conversations with the vice president or his campaign people. I will say this. At the end of the day, forgive me for being so cold-blooded, but at the end of the day, I believe that the strategic objective of any campaign is to win. That's it. Just win. Just win. And in this election, going back to that 27-20 formula, I believe that the vice presidential candidate should enhance the ticket's chance of winning that 20% in those 7 battleground states in those 20 or so counties. And so in my view, a vice presidential candidate should reflect what I call the 3 Ds. 1, diversity, 2, demography, and 3, defeating their opponent. Those are the 3 Ds that I think have to guide that decision.
I hear you, and I appreciate your discretion. Speak for a moment to the reliability of polling in a Trumpian world, because you have people, when I get a call, I usually hang up on the pollster, probably a mistake.
Yeah.
But many say one thing and they go into a polling booth, or they go up and write their absentee ballot and they do something quite different. So what do we take from the polls, which you just referenced, which clearly are dictating in a different direction right now?
So look, polling is clearly changing. The industry is changing. It's not as reliable as it used to be. People are not really being as honest as they may have in the past. But I will tell your viewers this: the charge that the polling was all wrong in 2016 is not true. Actually, the polls were pretty accurate in 2016. Now you may say, how is that possible? All the polls said that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and she lost. Well, if you take a look at that polling, and I would advise folks to do the same in this upcoming election, the polling of the national popular vote in 2016, it was right on, Rick. It was absolutely, it showed Clinton winning. She wasn't at 50%, but she was 2 or 3 points ahead of Trump in the national popular vote. That translated to about 3 million votes. That happened. The polling in those battleground states showed races that were too close to call. So if you take a look at the polling of Wisconsin between President Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016, it showed like a 2-point race within the margin of error. Same thing for Pennsylvania, same thing for Florida, same thing for North Carolina, same thing for Arizona. And so my advice to folks when they're reading these polls is twofold. First of all, disregard it all, because we don't know what the X factor is. And the X factor is what will happen in September? What will the president do in September? If he believes he's losing, that's a big X factor. You know, we used to call it an October surprise. I now call it the X factor. And secondly, disregard these national polls. They don't amount to anything. Take a look at the polling in critical battleground media markets. That will give you an indication of who's going to win or lose.
You just raised the point I was going to get into, which is, do you fear at all that if the polls continue to decline for President Trump, that not only would he challenge in court absentee ballots, but would seek to in some way, although I don't think he has any legal basis for doing this, delay the election?
It would be very hard for him to delay the election. I'm more concerned with the post-election possibilities than the pre-election possibilities. Although I will say that I'm very concerned with attempts to suppress votes of specific people, African Americans who are voting, about 95% to not to reelect the president, young people, students. I think that there's going to be a very significant attempt to suppress that vote. But what happens after the election is something that's kind of occupying my thoughts, not just as a political analyst, but as somebody who loves reading and writing. And I think there's a book here. What happens if President Trump loses by a handful of electoral votes and less than 3 million popular votes? Well, I think it's fair to say that he would at least consider going to the American people several days later and say, this was a rigged election. I won. I mean, remember, he actually told a group of members of my former colleagues in Congress, after he was inaugurated, he said, I won the popular vote. And they said, well, Mr. President, first of all, you won the presidency. That's the only thing that you should be thinking about, and congratulations. And number two, you lost the popular vote. And he said, no, I didn't. It was all fixed. Illegal immigrants, voted, and criminals and all sorts of people. Just not true. And then he told us the night of the inaugural, my poor Sean Spicer, a good friend of mine, poor Sean Spicer, he made go out and say that there were more people at the inaugural than there were for Barack Obama, which the photographs said aren't true. So what happens if the day after the election he says, I won the popular vote and the Electoral College, it was fixed. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to protect and defend the Constitution against this foreign or domestic manipulation of the election. What do we do then? Which means that, and by the way, Rick, I should tell you, different groups have actually gamed this out. There have been simulations on this, what happens. Which means that a convincing win, a double-digit win in the Electoral College, and a 5 to 7 to 8 million vote win in the popular vote is the only thing that I think would force the president to step back. God, do I hope I'm wrong. I really do hope that I'm being a paranoid writer of spy thrillers and political thrillers, but it's not beyond the pale of possibility.
Let me just digress for a minute. I totally agree with your pessimism. Two of Steve's wonderful books are on his left and right shoulder. I recommend them to the audience. But I share your pessimism. Those 70-some days, I think a lot of damage could be done. I also personally feel that you will need to pry him from office if he loses, and that will not be an easy thing. But let me turn for a moment to something you just touched on before we go to Congress, and that is the Electoral College. To reform that is a difficult exercise, but there's also something, the National Popular Vote Compact, and you have 15 states in the District of Columbia that have signed on to it, which allows for proportional voting. So you don't win a state if you win by a handful of votes.
Look, you cannot say that you're a democracy when the majority loses an election, right? You're not a democracy when a majority of voters select a candidate and that candidate loses because of this antiquated system called the Electoral College. I will tell you, Rick, that my conversations with my former colleagues, Republicans and Democrats alike, if they represent a small state, they're not voting for any Electoral College reforms, right? So, I'm pragmatic about this. We're not going to see any fundamental reforms at the federal level in the Electoral College. I sponsored a bill, which I thought might be gimmicky, but also common sense. My legislation would have awarded the winner of the popular vote an additional 3 Electoral College votes. They'd get a bonus if they won the popular vote to at least begin to level the playing field. I have the sad duty to tell you that it had a total of 1 co-sponsor and sponsor, both me. Never went anywhere. The only hope we have for electoral college reform will be national compacts like the one that you have spoken about, where states on their own say, we will award our electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. The other reform that I think we need beyond the electoral college, the fundamental political reform that this country needs now more than ever, is to eliminate partisan gerrymandering. It is the reason that the Congress is in the state that it is in. And we ought to get to that as soon as humanly possible.
That should be a session of itself. I totally agree with you. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court hasn't agreed with you of late on the reviewability of that. So let's turn to Congress for a minute. When we talked recently, you spoke about the dysfunction of Congress. Mm-hmm. What are your views on, are we seeing, I pray not, the end of bipartisanship? And as a second follow-up, since I'm only going to ask a few more questions before we go to audience Q&A, our daughter-in-law who's on the call wanted to know your views on how do we increase the diversity of Congress.
So let me take your daughter-in-law's question first, and I'm so happy that she's on this program. Congress actually has become more diverse. Take a look at the class of 2018, extraordinary increase in the number of women coming to Congress. They began the day after the inauguration, taking to the streets, and then they continued their activism, getting their names on ballots. And so you have really an amazing influx of women who are serving in Congress and people of color. And look, in fairness, I mean, there's a Republican congressional primary, I think in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, where you have an African-American Republican in a primary. We need more of that. We have to have more diversity in the United States Congress. The only diversity in Congress should not be the color of the Brooks Brothers ties that men wear to caucus meetings. And I'm sorry, the first question
on bipartisanship.
Okay, so let me give you some good news and some bad news on that issue. The good news is that Congress is not nearly as turbulent as it's made out to be. Because of social media and because of the tribalization of principally cable television, the people watching this are exposed to a view of Congress that is just combative, where people are screaming constantly, yelling at each other, can't agree on anything, no consensus, no cooperation, no compromise. It's like a World War II battlefield. Not true, actually. I'm really happy to tell you that Congress is actually a much calmer and more cooperative place than you would think. It's like a storm over an ocean surface, right? So the waves are frothy and it's violent and kinetic, but underneath those waves, it's pretty calm. I spent a lot of my time trying to find friends on the other side of the aisle. And I did it based on this theory. Democrats and Republicans are going to disagree on 75% of the issues. That's okay. There's a reason I'm a Democrat. There's a reason that, Congressman Lee Zeldin is a Republican, for people who, are represented by him. He and I have different views on 75% of the issues. The problem with Congress is that it spends all its time on the 75% where it's never going to agree, instead of focusing on the 25% where there's almost instant agreement. And so I think there is hope if we can get more members of Congress from more moderate districts who are incentivized by compromise and common ground and not disincentivized by those things, we'll be much better off, which gets back to redistricting. When districts are drawn to protect somebody from the far left or the far right, from a primary challenge from the further left and the further right, you have incumbents who don't fear the opposite party, they fear their own party. And that forces them to the extremes. They get punished for compromise instead of rewarded. And that's the fundamental problem we have now.
It's too bad you're still not in Congress, because you are a force of bipartisanship. That's so right. Turn for a second to the issue of the Senate. The Senate is in play in this election. Do you see it as potentially turning? And speak for a moment also about interesting race with Mitch McConnell by Amy McGrath, and actually she has a primary challenge next week. But where you see that going?
Sure. Look, so my again, with all due caution, because
Yeah.
we don't know what's going to happen. If the election were held today, the Democrats would actually pick up seats in the House. Nobody believed that as recently as the beginning of this year. The forecast was that the Democrats could lose 1 to 3 seats in the House, but that the Republicans would not pick up the majority. And we know that the Republicans could not pick up the majority because about 30 of them have retired. They retired. Present company accepted. When members of Congress retire, in many cases, it's because they're in the minority and they see no path to the majority and they just feel ineffectual and they decide, might as well just go home. And so the House it was never anticipated the Republicans would pick up the House. It was anticipated that the Democrats would lose a few seats. Now the projection is that the Democrats could actually gain as many as double digits. Senate, I'm still skeptical that the Democrats can pick up the Senate. Their field is growing. Their state of play is growing. There's now a competitive race in Montana, which nobody really thought because Governor Bullock got into it. Senator Ernst, the Republican senator from Iowa, is trailing Senator McSally, the Republican senator from Arizona, is now trailing by double digits. But the Democrats still need to pick up a net of 4 seats to have the majority in the Senate. They're likely to lose one, Doug Jones, Democrat in Alabama.
Yeah.
So they're likely to lose one. That means that they've got to defeat 4 other Republicans. I don't see where they get the 4 right now. I could be wrong. Senator Schumer would disagree adamantly with me. I think we have to let this bake a little more to see where we are in September. So my prediction right now is that Mitch McConnell will continue to be the majority leader in the Senate, and the Democrats will retain the House. And I think we're looking at a very, very close presidential election.
Last question before we turn it over to Natalie. Since we're with all the libraries at the East End, kindly, any comments on the race with Lee Zeldin in the 1st Congressional District of New York?
Sure. To the contentment of some and the consternation of others, Lee and I had a very good working relationship. The beauty of the Long Island delegation is that we disagreed on so many issues, but we realized that we were there to do what was best for our region. And so Lee and I worked very closely together on a variety of issues. If I see this in a 30-second ad, I'm going to sue Lee and then say bad things about him. Having said that, again, diagnostically, when you look at that district, when I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and Tim Bishop was the congressman there, I will tell you that about this area of my head grew the gray hairs over that one district, over New York's 1st Congressional District, because it was so unpredictable. Voted for Barack Obama in 2008, voted for to re-elect Barack Obama in 2012, sent Tim Bishop to Congress repeatedly, and then just really turned sharply and voted for Donald Trump. And Congressman Zeldin, if he were sitting next to me, he would tell you that he is close to the president, close to the White House, and wouldn't disavow that. There's a Democratic primary, as most people know, next Tuesday. All of the candidates are superb. It's too early to predict where the district will go without knowing who the Democratic candidate will be. And so why don't we reconvene with our libraries sometime in October to do a state of play of the entire race, and we can really key in on New York 1 because we'll have a lot more information then.
Sounds great. Thank you, Steve. Natalie, let me turn it back to you, if I may, for Q&A from the audience.
Absolutely. So everybody will look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the raise hand function. If you click on that, it lets us know that you have a question for one of our panelists tonight, and I can work to unmute you. So it looks like Stephen Benardo has raised his hand. Stephen, if you can go ahead and just unmute yourself. You can ask your question.
Hi, there obviously, good afternoon, good evening. There have been three ways people have been gerrymandered. By collusion between the parties, when they both want to make sure that they protect each other. By trying to gerrymander to control a district. And there's the third way. For a long time, there were districts gerrymandered to ensure minority representation.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you thought the third way continued to be an appropriate gerrymandering.
Well, I think I would disagree with you on the technicality of gerrymandering. As you know, Stephen, gerrymandering was named after Elbridge Gerry in the 1790s, I guess it was. Forgive me if I don't have the exact date, because the practice of Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts that has been followed up until the present time was specifically to draw lines not to ensure minority representation or compliance with the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, but to guarantee that you couldn't lose. And that has been thoroughly abused. I'll give you an example. The Pennsylvania 7th Congressional District for a long time, it's the suburbs and exurbs of Philadelphia, Rick. It was called Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. That's what we called it. Why? Because it was drawn to exclude by a Republican governor and Republican state legislature, in that case, to exclude pockets of Democrats and then wrap around pockets of Republicans. And at the end of the day, it looked like a caricature of the Disney characters, Goofy kicking Donald Duck in an unkind part of Donald's anatomy. Now, Democrats do the same thing, by the way. But we're all guilty. When I chaired the DCCC, you bet I was looking at trying to protect as many Democratic incumbents as I could, and I regret it. So the political practice of gerrymandering has had everything to do with winning versus losing. And then you had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which actually found that you could not gerrymander to discriminate against minorities. And as you know, as I'm sure you know, Stephen, the practice was in a district, and particularly in southern states, in North Carolina, in Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, which had a significant black population, they would pack those African Americans into a single district, which would produce a Democratic incumbent in order to ensure that every other seat in the state was Republican. And again, no party has a monopoly on this. Both parties are guilty of drawing lines for different reasons, but specifically Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act asked the Department of Justice to ensure that packing districts with minorities could not be accomplished through gerrymandering. Should we go?
Great. So again, if anybody has a question, please just use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, it lets me know that you have something that you'd like to ask. So our next question comes from Rosalie. Rosalie, if you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Rosalie. Hello, Rosalie.
Hi, this is Stephen.
Hi, Stephen.
I'm Rosalie's husband for 47 years.
Oh.
Been a Democrat, independent my whole life.
Stephen, where are you calling from?
Southampton, New York.
Southampton? Okay.
In the North Sea area.
Yeah.
So my question to you guys is that how do you get the vote out? My belief is that this vote your life depends on it. And it may not be your real life, but it will be your living life. And on all aspects, for young people, for retired people, for people who are in nursing homes who literally are taken care of. We have a terrible record as the greatest system ever devised of having the crappiest voting percentage per population.
Yeah.
If we get the vote out, we have to win.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, Stephen. And let me kind of step back from the immediate issue of how do you get the vote out, which is really a matter of making sure people are registered in neighborhoods, making sure that there's access to the polls through absentee ballots. But if you don't mind, Rick, I'd love to just kind of add some historic perspective to this question of voter turnout. Stephen rightly said that the United States of America has one of the worst voter participation levels of any industrialized democracy in the world. And I looked into that when I was a member of Congress, and this is what I learned. And so here's a question, Rick. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this question, but now you said people were going to stump me. I'm going to see if I can stump you.
Okay.
Rick, why do we vote on Tuesdays in America? Do you know?
I know that we have explored other days, but there's some historical antecedent. I don't know the precise. I could tell you better issues like the percentage of voting in other countries versus our country, but I don't know the precise reason.
Well, let me give you the answer. We vote on Tuesdays because Tuesday was set as the day for federal elections by the United States Congress in, I believe, the 1840s. Why Tuesday? Here's why. We were an agrarian society in the 1840s. And in order to make sure that farmers could leave their farms and travel to their county seats, which is where the polls were, you had to be sensitive to the schedule. Sunday was Lord's Day. You couldn't ask farmers to travel on Lord's Day, right? Monday would be travel day. They would leave their farms on Monday and travel to their county seats. They would vote on Tuesday, travel back on Wednesday, return to their farms and farm Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. That is why we vote on Tuesday. And to this day, or actually there've been quite a few reforms, but until fairly recently, it was always that way, which explained why we had such low levels of participation. Part of it was disenfranchisement, part of it was laziness, part of it was apathy, but for a lot of people it was, I have two jobs, I can't get to the polls. Now, what's happened? One of the refreshing things in America on both sides of the aisle has been the recognition that people should have more than a Tuesday to cast their vote. And so you have now all mail ballots in several states. You have expanded voting hours in several states. I introduced legislation to provide for weekend voting, where you'd be able to vote on Saturday or Sunday. It was getting a lot of attention. A lot of people liked it on both sides of the aisle. But it's not as necessary now, that weekend voting idea, because so many states have decided on their own to make it easier for people to vote other than one Tuesday a year.
Well, just to add one point before Natalie goes on, you know, in the Scandinavian countries, as you probably know, you have voting over 90%. And it seems scandalous. In Australia, you get a fine if you do not vote, because they view it as part of the responsibility of being a citizen. What's wrong with that theory?
Well, I would just say this, and then Natalie's going to go to the next question. It gets back to what I was saying at the outset and why I just so value our libraries. Voting is an exercise in democracy, but it can't be done based on a lack of information. You can't cast a vote without having some civic virtue, without having some civic engagement, civic literacy. I just saw a study, this is just shocking. Fewer than 20%, I believe the number was, of people who have graduated high school can name all three branches of the federal government. But about 45% of the same cohort can name all three stooges. A significant number of Americans believe that the Bill of Rights includes the right to own a pet. A significant number of Americans believes that the Bill of Rights includes the right to own a house. Something has happened to civic engagement in this country and civic literacy. I hope I don't offend anybody, but we've been so focused on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and I'm glad that we focused on those things. But I worry whether it has come at the loss of the study of civics and American history. and how democracy works. And that's why our libraries are so important. It's why I'm joining you for this session. Natalie, why don't we go to the next question?
Absolutely. So our next question comes from Sue Flesher. Sue, if you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, Sue. Sue, you there? Sue?
Yep, looks like Sue, you're unmuted if you want to just go ahead and ask your question.
I think maybe we should move to the next one and maybe Sue can come back later.
All right, Sue, if you get your tech worked out, we're happy to have your question. So I know, Rick, you had a final question. That's it for our audience. So Rick, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, we can circle back with Sue after and see if Sue has her tech working.
That's fine. Steve, I guess I ask this often when I do some of these sessions, and I'm so grateful for your insights and time. It's hard not to be an insomniac in today's world today. What keeps you awake at night, whether it's related to the November election or other issues facing our country beyond issues you've already so ably identified?
I'll tell you what keeps me awake, and I'll tell you what gives me hope. What keeps me awake is the animosity that we have for one another. Something like 12% of Republicans believe, I saw this poll recently, 12% of Republicans believe that Democrats are evil. And a lower percentage, but not much lower, of Democrats think that Republicans are evil. There was a time when we were Americans with different parties. Now we seem to be growing into a new civil war and a civic war. That keeps me up at night because it's so easily exploitable by nefarious powers abroad. Lincoln was right when he said a house divided cannot stand. If we continue this path, it's irreparable. Now, the reasons for this divide have to do with social media, where we're literally curating our own news. You don't get news from social media. You probably delete people with whom you vehemently disagree, and you bring in friends with whom you agree. You decide what news content you're going to listen to. And social media has become horribly distorted. People are getting their information from bots, not from real people. Cable news, as Penny said, I appeared on MSNBC. I haven't appeared in a while because of COVID. But before that, I'd appear 2 or 3 times a week. Look, folks, if you're watching MSNBC, I can promise you that you're left of center. And if you're watching Fox News, I can promise you that you are right of center with some variance. But we're not listening to news for news. We're listening to news for bias confirmation because we want to hear pundits agree with us. Think about how this contrasts with how we got our news in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. We got it from Walter Cronkite. You'd go home, you'd turn on CBS or Huntley Brinkley or Howard K. Smith, and you would listen and form your own judgments. Now we don't listen, we just root for what we hear. And the third problem goes back to gerrymandering. We have become so isolated. There was a study, fascinating study, on how red and blue we are. And it looked at, and Rick, I know you're going to find this fascinating. It looked at the ideology of where we eat at restaurants. It looked at every single congressional district in America, and this is what it found. If you live within 50 miles of a Cracker Barrel restaurant, your member of Congress is likely to be a Republican. If you live within 50 miles of a Whole Foods, your member of Congress is likely to be a Democrat. If you live within 50 miles of both a Whole Foods and a Cracker Barrel, you are in a swing district. So we have Cracker Barrel and Whole Foods district. And if you're a member of Congress or a constituent in a Whole Foods district, you start off at the Starbucks in the morning. Well, you wake up and you're watching Morning Joe. Then you go to the Starbucks where everybody's agreeing with you. Then you go to work where mostly everybody's agreeing with you. Then you go to a nice restaurant in the Hamptons for lunch and everybody's agreeing with you. Then you go back home, you go out to dinner, and mostly everybody's agreeing with you. Then you go home, you turn on Rachel Maddow. Hers is the last voice you hear before you drift off to sleep. And so no wonder you hear an occasional Republican sentiment and say, what the heck? These are aliens. What planet are they living on? You really do think they're living on a different planet because your planet is blue. And the same thing happens with people living in those Cracker Barrel districts. They're watching Fox. They're going to Rotary Club where they're hearing that Donald Trump is the greatest president ever. The last voice they listen to is Sean Hannity. The first voice they listen to is voices they listen to are Fox and Friends. And it is a mess. I worry that there is no more common ground, or it's beginning to dwindle. And there are solutions. We should reimpose the fairness doctrine in the media and equal access so that when you're watching the news, you're getting both sides. What makes me hopeful? What makes me hopeful is I know you'll find this hard to believe, but I learned the lesson in Congress that people in Congress, they generally want to do the right thing. They are patriots. We may vehemently disagree, but when you can get members who are willing to put down their partisan impulses and find something to agree on, I get hopeful. And what really makes me hopeful, and we can close here with your consent, and I'm sure you have a final point to make, is I'm seeing an energy among young people that I've never seen before. And I see it as I teach at Cornell. I see young people with race and justice, at that intersection in Syosset, putting lawn signs up. I see it on gun safety. I wrote this novel, this political satire, Big Guns Behind Me. When the book came out, it skewers the gun lobby. But the Parkland kids, the kids who are becoming engaged and active, America never failed when any of its generations devoted itself to making life better for the next generation. And I think this upcoming generation, my generation may have screwed it up, but I believe this upcoming generation refuses to fail, refuses to lose its democracy, refuses to accept conditions that they find unjust and intolerable and wrong. And so I have more faith and hope in that generation that's coming up than the generation that is in power now. And which leads me to believe
God's ear.
Our destiny is strong and positive, and I will never lose. I'll retain my pragmatism, but I will never lose my optimism.
Thank you, Steve. From your mouth to God's ear. Before turning it back to Natalie to close, Steve, I would only say Eleanor Roosevelt's line, reminiscent of what you said, better to light a candle than curse the darkness. And I hope the younger generations do step up. Thank you so much for doing this.
Before we turn it to Natalie, let me invite people to visit the Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. Our web address, our internet address is iopga.cornell.edu. Rick, that's IOP as in politics, GA at cornell.edu. Next week, we have Congressman Adam Schiff coming on. We've had Reince Priebus, who is President Trump's chief of staff. We are very bipartisan. Our mission is to curate programs that deepen discourse and raise understanding. They're free, and we invite you to participate by checking out our website. And Natalie, why don't you close us out? And forgive me, Rick, thank you for being such an outstanding moderator.
Thank you, Steve.
I hope we can do this again. And Penny and all your partners, thank you as well.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. Please feel free to check out our website and see what's upcoming. Thank you to Penny and to Rick for hosting us.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.